Linklater's Before trilogy is a fascinating series of 3 films which are dominated by conversation, predominantly the characters played by Judy Delpy and Ethan Hawke, and when I first heard that about the trilogy, I was understandably confused as to how that would work and how the film would operate on the whole. So I watched the trilogy and it was absolutely amazing. The simple, engaging, unique and thought-provoking works that Linklater had created. And there's a lot to why they're so wonderfully special, but that's for another day. 14 years prior to the release of Before Sunrise, My Dinner with Andrè released. And it seems clear from the title that Louis Malle had intended for each viewer to have their own very personal experience with this work. There's no specificity within the title as to who My is referring to. And really it isn't Wallace Shawn. It's you, it's me, it's the viewer who adopts the position of Wally within the film. And right from the get-go, he's depicted as quite an ordinary guy with relatable struggles and issues that we all have in our everyday lives.
The life of a playwright is tough. It's not easy, as some people seem to think. You work hard writing plays, and nobody puts them on. You take up other lines of work to try to make a living.
And that further blurs the line between us and Wally, and our persona becomes one and the same. I did have to sneak in a Bergman reference in there, and in fact Bergman is even referenced in the film.
Andrè had explained to George that he'd just been watching the Ingmar Bergman movie, Autumn Sonata.
Now, if you haven't seen Ingmar Bergman's Autumn Sonata, then I'd highly recommend you go and watch it. It's one of the greatest, densest, and most emotional films of all time. And just like My Dinner with Andrè, it has that similar, beautiful visual aesthetic. But more importantly, I think it has some real relevance to the film and what actually goes on within it. Autumn Sonata revolves around 2 characters, as does My Dinner with Andrè. But this time it's a mother and her daughter, and they have a troubled and strained relationship, and one day the mother comes to visit her daughter, and that night they burst into this sort of emotional dialogue where confessions are made, truths are revealed, and harboured feelings come out. And a large part of the film is the conversation they have at night. Now that's most definitely not doing this Bergman masterpiece any justice, but that's the core of the information that's actually relevant to My Dinner with Andrè. Now in My Dinner with Andrè, 99% of the film is the discussion between Wally and Andrè that they have in real time over dinner, where hidden truths are revealed and so on and so forth. Now the fact that the entire discussion takes place in real time, without any jump cuts, and lasts for about an hour and 45 minutes, and on top of that kept me so engaged and gripped for the whole duration, means that there's definitely something going on beneath the surface. That's primarily the film's structure. It's structured like a 3-course meal. At first there's an introduction prior to Wally actually sitting down with Andrè for that particular dinner, and Wally expresses a lot of doubt in the voiceover he gives in the opening about meeting up with Andrè, just like a person may feel going to a restaurant they've never been to before, or indeed meeting up with someone that you feel a little hesitant to. And I'm sure we've all been in that situation where that does occur, but you still decide to go through with it anyways. And that feeling of doubt shrouds the opening sequence, which, might I add, is a fantastic opening to a film. It's one of the great ways in which a filmmaker merges the protagonist with the viewer. Now, instead of an obsession slowly growing within the protagonist, and as like in Coppola's Apocalypse Now, or in the film which heavily inspired it, Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God, we have a character in here who feels a little uneasy and a little anxious about the upcoming events. It's the opposite of being obsessed. Now, upon entering the restaurant, we meet Andrè for the first time, who's been built up in a sort of way, and the menu is handed to Wally. And then we select the specific dishes we would like to order, and we come up with an idea of what each dish would taste like, what this discussion will be, and we hypothesize and imagine and then come up with a sort of judgment as to what this discussion between the 2 characters will be like. And Wally does this with both the food, as he questions what's this like and what's that like, unable to really delve into the world with confidence.
What is that?
It's a sort of pâté, light, made of fish.
And also with the conversation. Then Andrè begins to tell Wally a story about what was going on with him during this period in which he was away, which was mentioned in the opening sequence. And Wally is utterly fascinated, just as I was, glued to the screen listening to these bizarre and often funny stories of André's travels. Now that represents the first course of the meal, the appetizer before the meat, a nice introduction, everything seems pleasant and everything is still light. We hear, wonderful tales of all sorts of interesting things that happened to Andrè.
But the biggest event was 3 of the people kept disappearing in the middle of the night each night, and we knew they were preparing something big, but we didn't know what.
Then later on, as their main course is served and they begin to dig into it, Andrè begins to twist things around. Subversion occurs and the tables are turned. Not literally, this film is rather tame in that manner, but in terms of the conversation and the viewpoint Andrè has. This second course is more dense and different, and Andrè starts to express his regret with what he did and the negative feelings he has regarding his whole journey.
Well, frankly, I'm sort of repelled by the whole story, if you really want to know. What? Who did I think I was? That's a story of some kind of spoiled princess,
And the previously enamored Wally starts to get annoyed at this challenge to the wonderful dream he was just presented with. It's like if the princess gets killed and the villain wins at the end of a Disney film or something along those lines. We get challenged in this main course with a different dish, one that's heavier and more unusual. Wally rejects it, and the once passive observer then takes charge. He begins to argue against André's negative feelings regarding his whole journey and what he did.
Isn't it a little upsetting to come to the conclusion that there's no way to wake people up anymore except to involve them in some kind of a strange christening in Poland or some kind of a strange experience on top of Mount Everest?
And then everything culminates in the dessert. Wally and Andrè seem to get equal screen time in this portion towards the end of the film, with their two contrasting ideas going head to head.
I know what you're talking about. I don't really know what you're talking about.
Because I really do believe that if you're just living mechanically, then you have to change your life.
And they go the distance, and then it ends. A wonderful end to a unique and interesting meal, a conversation rich with nutritional value, where deep topics were explored and the characters challenged their beliefs, and so do we. It's contemplative and thought-provoking, and after all, isn't that what a masterpiece is meant to be? When the film ends, there's a change. We began with light and we depart in dark, and there's a sense of uncertainty about how our lives are going to progress from here on out. It's a feeling akin to the one that we get at the end of Truffaut's The 400 Blows. Something has definitely changed. We've been moved emotionally and modified by this meal and this film. The transcendental experience we just had is capped off with a dreamlike taxi trip home. And that's where it ends.
When I finally came in, Debbie was home from work, and I told her everything about my dinner with Andrè.